All right, guys. I asked if some of you wanted to see one other kind of crash course video here, and let me see what I can provide for you. Preparation to get through this rubric that you see on my screen here. We'll talk about that at the end. But really, kind of what I want to do is walk you through the time periods 3 through 7 that will be on the exam in a very big picture, thematic kind of perspective, maybe with a couple gems of specifics that might jog your memory of things that you might want to kind of talk about or recall if you see an opportunity to do so on the exam. Okay? Um, so let's start with time period 3, 1754 to 1800. We're going to call the major theme revolution. The two subtopics here are going to be the causes of the colonial resistance and eventual calls for independence, and then the foundations of American government. When we talk about the causes of colonial resistance, I so eloquently put that back last fall in school as right Cartman. What pissed off the colonists so much that they just had to declare independence? First off, I think it's important to know that we should never talk in absolutes, right? That, um, we're going to get to the Civil War. All Northerners were against slavery, or in this case, all Americans wanted independence from Great Britain. We know that absolutes like that never work. They certainly don't work when we're talking about the American Revolution. We even did our class debate, if you'll recall, when we did patriots versus loyalists. So there were people on both sides, and this was kind of a snowballing effect that America got to independence after kind of being pissed off by a number of factors. And eventually, enough of them became angry enough and became convinced enough that a revolution was necessary. Okay, but that was a process. So what was behind that process? Because that's the causes for colonial resistance and the causes of these calls, emerging calls for independence. One is remember what I talked about the economic booty call, right? That's mercantilism, the idea that colonies exist just to make a mother country wealthy, and this concept of salutary neglect, right? That Great Britain essentially didn't really care much about governing the colonies other than, hey, but get us our raw materials and make sure that Mother England gets wealthy off of this deal, right? Then we have instances like the French and Indian War. Remember, the Americans, as it were, felt like they were the foot soldiers, they were the infantry, they won the war, but then they were met with the proclamation of 1763. The farmers, especially in the South, weren't able to get what they thought they had won, which is land beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And the colonial government prevented them from going there. Certainly, taxation without representation is a major cause, right? You see instances like the Boston Tea Party, and we have that call, taxation without representation, but that is not the defining factor in and of itself. One of the other things that's taking place here is these colonists live in this age of enlightenment, right? Where a lot of brilliant men are writing about the very nature of the relationship between governments and those that they govern. Um, and so that's going to be a perfect segue when America sees that Great Britain is not living up to those principles. That those principles should therefore make up the foundation of American government. And so when we're talking about the Age of Enlightenment, we're talking about John Locke and the social contract theory. We're talking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Baron de Montesquieu, who write not only about the relationship between governments and the governed, but also about the structure of government, right? And checks and balances, and America certainly has some of that, even early on, when we're living under the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation, it becomes obvious early on, are too weak to sustain, right? George Washington, I do not think we can, a nation can sustain itself for very long. With such a without a central power which will pervade the whole union. He's calling for a central government there. And Shays' Rebellion had illustrated that uh, the Articles of Confederation were too weak to do the job. So when we get into establishing principles of federalism, a strong central government surrounded and supported by political subunits or the states, right? We have Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton writing under the name Publius for the Federalist Papers, talking about checks and balances and how this new government will work. And so we get to the Constitutional Convention and we have this federalist system of government that is only going to continue to get strengthened, right, under George Washington with things like the Judiciary Act, with his ability to then put down the Whiskey Rebellion, which was very similar to Shays' Rebellion that the Articles of Confederation couldn't handle. Well, Washington's new federal government can handle it. Ultimately, when Washington is succeeded after his famous farewell address, um, which he sets the precedent of a two-term limit and warns about the emerging, role of political parties. John Adams strengthens the federal government with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, ironically, that's also kind of a turn where we get to a transition in political parties when we get to Jeffersonian democracy with the election of 1800. But that key election of 1800 simply proves that America, as this young republic, can survive this change of partisan power at the executive level. And so the election of 1800 is monumental in early American history in actually strengthening the federal government, okay? And becomes really a foundation of American government that these transitions, these elections can work. And here we are on our third president, and we have a strong national government by the time we get to the year 1800. That brings us to the end of time period 3. I'm one page through my outline. We're into time period 4. Time period 4, your time period is 1800 to 1848. Our central idea, guys, is expansion. Okay. And so, yes, we have some political expansion, and we wrote our last essay about these evolving political parties. But we still have this expanding national government. We have Alexander Hamilton's financial plan coming to fruition, establishing a federal bank. Okay, kind of if you were a Democratic Republican as opposed to a Federalist, you would say that that is a constitutional reach that you would be more in favor, right, if you were a Democratic Republican, of a strict constructionalism way of viewing the Constitution. Federalists say, hey, we have some wiggle room. We can, it doesn't say we can establish this bank, but we can grow the government. And so, under this theme of expansion, time period 4, 1800 to 1848, the first arena we're going to talk about is this kind of political expansion. Okay. We're going to see some Supreme Court cases like Marbury v. Madison. Remember, Marbury was the first time that the judicial branch exercised its right for this concept of judicial review, that they can declare unconstitutional acts of the other two branches. We have cases like McCulloch v. Maryland that establish supremacy of the federal government over state governments. So again, the federal government is expanding its power. There are national reform movements taking place. The emerging movement for abolition of slavery, for women's suffrage, for a temperance movement. Okay, and eventually all of these things will happen, right? We will have slavery abolished, we will have women's suffrage, and for a short time, we'll have temperance or prohibition of alcohol. But you're going to see kind of this growing expansion of kind of a political America. More importantly, time period 4, 1800 to 1848, expansion. We're talking about the borders, the growth of America. Of course, we're talking about manifest destiny, the belief that from sea to shining sea, this North American continent is ours by rights under God, right? Um, Remember that painting that I spent some time with The painting is American Progress by John Gast, shows Lady Progress, uh, you know, moving out west. And we've got the laying of the railroads and the telegraph lines and briefly the stagecoach. And we're driving the Indians into the darkness and bringing the light. And so a lot of what we talk about with expansion absolutely centers around this concept of manifest destiny, notably made possible in large part by Thomas Jefferson's 1803 Louisiana Purchase, which he did not, as a Democratic Republican, feel he necessarily had the constitutional authority to complete. But hey, it was a darn good real estate deal. Okay. We also see emergence of new technologies, and notably in this period, 1800 to 1848, we call this the antebellum period. And okay, a little bit more beyond. So, antebellum period simply means prior to war. In our verbiage, it's always going to mean prior to the Civil War. We see emerging technologies which will cause very notably a divide between northern states and southern states, kind of along economic lines. And some of that can be traced back to the earliest days, just based upon physical geography, right? That in the South, the land was more suited for kind of large scale, single and cash crop farming. And in the North, that rocky soil made it less advantageous for that kind of economy, agricultural economy, but more for what the Federalists would have liked to see, kind of this urban America, right? And so we see the emergence of towns in the North and blacksmithing and shipbuilding and that sort of thing. Well, those divides are going to exacerbate here in time period four, when we have like the Lowell system creating industry up north, the canals being built up north, whereas in the South, cotton is king, king cotton, and the cotton gin only is going to actually exacerbate that difference because the increased ability to produce cotton will increase demand and will increase Southern reliance on slavery. Okay, and that really is the divide that will lead us towards the Civil War. So, period four is in large part about a growing American government between 1800 and 1848, the expansion of national powers and American politics, and the expansion of these American borders, as we'll see in our next time period, is largely laid out along these kind of divisive lines, almost two Americas forming between the North and the South. We're going to get to the Civil War, but not before we're almost complete. Sea to shining sea, manifest destiny, time period four. Second page done. We're moving along. We're in time period five, guys. The major theme, Civil War. Your years, 1844 to 1877. So we're kind of tacking on some bookends to the Civil War, right? So what are the causes? Well, we just went over a lot. A lot of the causes. Listen, the cause of the Civil War is generally slavery. Now, again, that doesn't mean that everyone in the North was anti-slavery and everyone in the South was pro-slavery. We're not talking in absolutes like that. But it is disingenuous to say that the cause of the Civil War is states' rights, because the fight over states' rights was in large part uh, determining the question of slavery. So this idea of manifest destiny, it proves to be, this westward expansion in divided America very much causes the divide that's going to lead to the Civil War. I would point to you when we did our big project and we kind of ranked the cause of the Civil War. Think about like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? That led to bleeding Kansas. And this was all about, well, what was the state of slavery going to be in these two new territories that were formed, in essence, to to build railroads going out west, and then, well, what's going to happen to slavery out west? Okay. So, as the South may have made this intellectual defense of slavery that it's a positive good, um, the question of slavery versus abolishing slavery really is all about states' rights, but it centers around slavery. Okay, and we have to recognize the role of a westward expanding America as that happens. Now, the election of Lincoln, of course, will become the immediate cause of the Civil War. But as we studied in classes here, there are so many factors leading up to that. The election of Lincoln will lead to South Carolina's secession. Remember that South Carolina had always been the state of nullification. We talked about, John C. Calhoun, that incredibly good looking man, and the nullification crisis. Well, that also goes back to that early divide, as early as Federalists and Anti Federalists, right? State rights versus national government rights, Democratic Republicans and states' rights, and Federalist and fighting for the expanding of federal power. So this is a constant theme, whether we're all the way back in time period 3 or even today that we talk about the federal government versus the states. Now, the war itself, because not to get it twisted, we're still sitting here in time period 5 on my outline, 1844 to 1877. The war itself is largely won because in the North, they have the industrial advantage. And I think we've talked about how those seeds have been planted. They had the majority of the railroads and so on and so forth. They get out of Gettysburg by the skin of their teeth, and eventually, but largely because of those industrial advantages, the North is going to win the war. What are the effects of the war? Well, they are numerous. Okay, we're going to get into Reconstruction, but it's ultimately going to be the Compromise of 1877 that ends Reconstruction, right? And we had kind of a hard versus soft Reconstruction. We saw the political cartoons, right, with Rutherford B. Hayes and the let him alone policy. I went on my TED talk about how the Compromise of 1877 is the single worst political decision in the history of America. But the results of the Civil War really, and then this period of Reconstruction essentially coming to an end with the Compromise of 1877 is going to be, in large part, this racially divided America that we're going to witness for like the next 100 years, right? And so we see some cartoons of Thomas Nast around this time. We have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the Civil War amendments, right? Abolish slavery, um, define citizenship and give citizenship to the former slaves, and give Black men the right to vote, largely ignored in a Jim Crow America where Black codes are present and sharecropping system takes place, in large part because the federal government allows for it. We have decisions like Plessy v. Ferguson, right, that allows this kind of separate but equal segregation. And so the effects of the Civil War essentially is going to be that we are still going to have very much a divided America, not necessarily along the lines of slavery, but in how America kind of recovers from the scars of the Civil War. Elsewhere, within this time period, we still have, Manifest Destiny is continuing. We have the Mexican American War. We have other things going on. We're still in this first wave of massive immigration, but the first wave being more Irish and Germans and so on. But we are now even if still suffering some divide, a very much a unified, much larger nation. Time period 5 comes to an end with Reconstruction at 1877. We're moving along. Time period 6, okay? 1865 to 1898. Our major theme is the Gilded Age, okay? And we're also going to get into progressivism as a result of the Gilded Age, right? And I think you will remember my kind of swinging of the pendulum, right? That American politics do this from kind of conservatism or laissez faire to kind of progressivism being where the government exists to kind of affect change in the lives of people. Well, the Gilded Age, remember, is this apple, shiny, right? It's covered in gold, but there's a rotten core on the inside. The Gilded Age, from the perspective of the shiny outside, is the America that people know with respect to the robber barons, right? You have Rockefeller and Standard Oil. J.P. Morgan essentially is a money man, right? And you have Andrew Carnegie, who is in the steel industry. And these guys are the best instances of the robber barons of the Gilded Age. Okay. Um, so when we get to the Industrial Revolution that takes place during this time, we have all sorts of crazy inventions going on. And one of them, probably the most notable, is the Bessemer process that can create this steel, right? And so this is going to help America continue to wrap up this manifest destiny to build the rail lines. Um, and what else we're going to see with these inventions and industry taking off is we're going to see the urbanization of America, right? Where America for the first time is going to become primarily or predominantly an urban as opposed to a rural America. It's to harken back, it's kind of now becoming the America that Alexander Hamilton would have viewed more than a Thomas Jefferson. We have a common society forming as a result of people living together and the Industrial Revolution, right? We have America's sitting around listening to the radio and kind of having this kind of common culture. We have the second wave of immigration, right? And now, in large part, in the eastern states, it's Eastern Europe. In the western states, it's from Asia, China in particular, who go to work on the railroads that are being built better now with this industrial revolution, the Bessemer process and steel and so on. And that's going to continue heating up this westward expansion where the United States is taking place in policies like land grant universities. NC State is one, Michigan State, a lot of the Midwestern state schools are land grant universities. The Homestead Act, they're trying to, give away land to Americans. They're trying to populate the land in between the shining seas. Okay. And the American farmers start to build this populist movement. Okay. Remember when we talked about, or if you just Googled again, the, Wizard of Oz and the Gilded Age and populism, and you'll get that kind of explanation of how the Wizard of Oz is an allegory for what's happening here politically at this time. Okay. But all of those factors, urbanization, immigration, the populist movement in this westward pushing America, also expose the rotten core of the Gilded Age. Okay. And when that rotten core gets exposed, in large part, right, because of like muckrakers, literally shining a light. Jacob Riis was the New York police photographer. I would so love it if Jacob Riis showed up as a document tomorrow, either something he said or wrote the How the Other Half Lives was his book, or some of his photography that literally shone a light on how urban America, for the most part, was living. It wasn't this Gilded Age, but there was a lot of corruption taking place. Big Boss Tweed, right? But where the underbelly was such that poor urban, especially new immigrant America, was kind of downtrodden and taken advantage of, and the pendulum will swing to kind of this progressive era. So we're going to have the muckrakers. You're going to have Upton Sinclair, right? Who exposes in the jungle, the meatpacking industry. And eventually, we're going to get into this wave of politicians that would fall under this general, a progressive kind of genre of politician. None more famous than, of course, my boy Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, but that's going to bring us to an end of time period 6. All right, where the theme was Gilded Age and progressivism, 1865 to 1898. I'm going to go through the last page here for you. Okay, time period 7. 1890 to 1945. The theme here is, well, World War One and World War Two, and kind of parenthetically in between, uh, everything in between, right? So World War One, hey, we're going to stay out of this thing, right? But Germany keeps on sinking passenger ships like the Lufthansa, and then we catch them with a Zimmerman note trying to get Mexico to go to war with us, and eventually we're drawn into war. And what do we do? Well, we do what we do, man. We win wars. Okay. But with that, we embark on this period of isolationism. Poor Woodrow Wilson is the president who, by the way, ran for re-elections on the campaign, right? He kept us out of war. That shows you that America does not want to be at war. That's his campaign that gets him reelected. And lo and behold, he gets us into war. Well, Germany gets us into war, but then he wins war. And now it's supposed to be, right, World War One, the war to end all wars. Wilson wants to see that done, and he comes up with his 14-point plan. And we're going to have kind of, uh, you know, open books among countries and a decreasing of American expansionism. I didn't talk a lot about that, but that is a lot what we saw, right? With Teddy Roosevelt, even with Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, Philippines, a lot of that was taking place. That was the new manifest destiny at the turn of the century. That's still time period 7, right? This new manifest destiny. But in the wake of World War One, all of that is going to be drawn down, right? But the Republicans, Wilson's a Democrat, the Republicans don't want it. And America enters this period of isolationism, okay, that we're going to stay into all the way into World War II. In between, there's a lot of stuff happening, right? But probably most notably, the roaring, or maybe not so roaring 20s, right? Um, in the wake of World War One, America's economy kind of takes off. We are definitely an urban, kind of common, connected economy. America is kind of living large in the cities. Advertising becomes an industry. America becomes a consumer economy. Cities like Chicago and New York are taking off. African Americans in the Harlem Renaissance, and America is living high on the hog here. Um, but there are some underlying problems to the American economy. The over the oversupply of American agriculture to feed a country at war all of a sudden comes to a crashing halt. Americans are largely living on credit and buying on margin, buying stock on credit. So it's the first time this party is kind of coalesced around a booming Wall Street, and it all comes crashing down when some of these red flags, kind of are realized here with Black Tuesday in October of 1929. And America enters what is known as the Great Depression, right? Which happens to be at the same time that we suffer from this cataclysmic Dust Bowl event. And so, through the darkest days in between these world wars in time period 7, we have what I think is a great president in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But the New Deal, alphabet soup, certainly, an expansionist federal government getting involved in kind of every facet of the American economy, but out of necessity with what was happening economically. But the fact of the matter is, it still isn't what pulls America out of the Great Depression. FDR does a great job, but ultimately, it is war that pulls America out. Now, war, I thought America was isolationist. Well, they were, right? And they were staying well out of World War II. And we had talked very recently about kind of incremental steps of who we're going to support with respect to World War II. But we were staying out of war, right? We could support Great Britain, with some high fives and some lend lease and some cash carry. But we weren't going to go to war until this time. It's not Germany, but it's Japan with the sucker punch, December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, that draws America into war. And that wartime economy absolutely pulls America out of the Great Depression, also changes life forever in America. Um, from the perspective of like Rosie the Riveter and women really playing a huge role in American victory. African Americans, remember at the Double V campaign, the African Americans were winning victory in war, and were seeking victory in civil rights at home. And so some of the seeds for the time period 8 civil rights movement are being planted here in World War II, right? And with D Day, June 6, 1944, ultimately being the largest battle, America is going to declare victory in for the Allies in the European theater, VE Day. And they turn all their attentions to Japan, first engaging in this island hopping strategy, but ultimately resorting to the use of nuclear warfare, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and declaring victory over Japan in August. And America, again, is, well, what do? We win wars. And we come back now to the strongest nation America has ever been. And in the wake of World War II, we have this kind of a vision of a bucolic, booming uh, economic giant and world leader that is America. This compliant culture, the Leave It to Beaver 1950s. But we also know that what we saw in World War II with respect to Rosie the Riveter and the African American soldiers is going to plant some seeds for this countercultural movement that's going to take place. Okay. So I'm not sure how long I've been going, but I have been trying to go time period by time period from time periods 3, 1754 to contextualizing time period 7 beyond 1945. So there you have it, guys. A lot of stuff thrown your way, hopefully a couple of gems along the way as well. And you've been looking at this rubric the whole time. Get that contextualization, okay? Going far enough back, but not so far that it's not irrelevant to contextualize whatever the bookend, the opening bookend of your prompt is. Give yourself a thesis that has da 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 da, some richness, some contrast. Okay, um, and uh, and you got 2 points right off the bat. Describe 2 documents and how they relate to the prompt. That's it. You got 3 points. Support your argument. You can use those same 2 documents, okay, and talk about how they support your thesis, that strong part, da 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 da, part of your thesis, okay, with 2 documents. Do it for 4. You got another 2 points, and you're up to 4 points. Do it with a couple hip happies. All right, do that on 2 documents. Uh, Intended audience, perspective, point of view. Um, so get into doing that on 2 documents, guys, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points right there. Go to some outside evidence. Hopefully, I gave you something here today, even, and you're up to like 8 points, right? And then you've got an opportunity to do more, of course, when you get into your complex understanding and all that. But I think you guys can do a great job at killing this. Again, my last piece of advice is watch this video and then get your butts to bed. Get up in the morning, drink a lot of water, get a little workout in, small meal in you, get ready to go. Set up your space tonight. Have those crib sheet outlines, in front of you so you can work off paper to your computer. Um, Uninstall Grammarly. Don't have any open Google Docs. Okay. And attach a file for your submission rather than trying to do a copy paste. I hope I have helped you here with a little bit last minute crash course thing. It occurred to me as I was kind of laying down and reading my book and chilling. I'm like, man, I hope my kids are still studying. And if you are, then I'm here in this fight with you guys. All right. All right, guys. Y'all gonna go kill it. Love you. Peace.